The wind had fallen silent when I found it. Just a glint, barely visible through the ash-gray dust that clung to my gloves like time itself. I brushed gently, slow as breath, until the shape emerged. Unnatural, smooth, geometric. Not a bone, not a stone. Something meant. I radioed the Institute. They called it a mistake. Too advanced, they said. Too old. But it was neither. It was a clue. One of many. And that's how this began, not with a headline, but with a hesitation. A moment where reality blinked. 15 discoveries. Each one too strange to believe, too real to ignore. So implausible that even science, even reason recoiled. But I've learned something in the ruins. What doesn't fit the story might just be the truth. Come. There's a trail beneath the dust, and it's still warm. The wind off the Gulf of Maine carried the smell of pine and brine when I first stepped onto the excavation site at Naskiak Point. The ground here was stubborn, rocky, rooted, but beneath it lay traces of a people who called this coast home over 1,000 years ago. We were cataloging shell middens, bone tools, fragments of pottery ordinary for the woodland era. Then came something that made the trowels stop. A flash of dull silver glinted from the soil. Not shaped like anything local, not stone, not bone. It was round, and it bore markings none of the team recognized. We cleaned it carefully. On one side, a stylized cross. On the other, a faint, worn face bearded, crowned. It wasn't colonial, wasn't French, wasn't native. The metallurgist confirmed it almost immediately. It was a Norse coin, a silver penny from the reign of Olaf Kyrre, King of Norway, circa 1065 AD. The dig went silent. That coin, now known as the Maine penny, shouldn't have been here. By all official accounts, Norse explorers like Leif Erikson only made it as far as Newfoundland, to the settlement we now call Lance aux Meadows. And yet, here was their currency, in soil walked by the ancestors of the Wabanaki. The academic response came swiftly. Some claimed it had been dropped there by a modern collector or planted by a prankster. Others suggested it had been traded from hand to hand, tribe to tribe, drifting south over centuries. But the context didn't fit. The coin was found with tools and ornaments buried centuries before any known European arrival. And there was no trace of modern intrusion, no hole, no shift in the soil layers. If it had traveled, it had done so across generations, across languages, across entirely separate worlds. But that's not the end of it. Just north of the site, local fishermen talk of stone foundations in the shallows too square, too uniform to be natural. When the tides pull back just right, they claim, the outlines of long structures appear beneath the kelp. One old man whispered to me, "They came in summer, built nothing tall, left before the snows." I asked him who he meant. He just tapped his chest and said, "People who sailed by stars." There are Norse sagas passed down as poetry, as fireside warnings that speak of journeys beyond Greenland, of hostile natives, deep forests, bitter fruit. One even mentions a land called Vinland, where the days were longer and the winters strange. Could Vinland have reached this far south? Somewhere between the archaeology and the folklore, a gap remains, wide enough for a ship's keel to cut through. I held that coin under my flashlight one night, alone in my tent. The face of the king was nearly gone, worn smooth by time, by hands, by the long chain of history. But the weight of it was undeniable. Not just its metal, but its meaning. If the Norse left no forts here, no stones piled in walls, perhaps they left stories, traded goods, memory. And maybe, just maybe, they left behind a single silver coin, as quiet proof they had once stood on this very shore. Another fragment of an erased epoch. Another whisper from a past the textbooks never wrote. We move on. But I keep the coin's photo in my field journal. Not as evidence. As a reminder that even when the trail disappears, the truth still leaves a trace. The heat was thick in the Texas air when I arrived in the small town of London, not London, England, London, Texas. A place where ranchland stretches for miles, and time moves with the pace of dust settling on old iron. But it was here, by accident more than intention, that one of the strangest objects I've ever studied came to light. It was found by hikers in the 1,930 seconds, lodged in a stone nodule along a creek bed, the kind of discovery you'd almost ignore until you crack the rock open. Inside, as if cradled by the earth itself, was a hammer. Not fossilized, not primitive. A hammer, iron head, wooden handle, partially colified. Its shape was unmistakable, the tool of a craftsman, forged by fire, shaped by hand. The kind you'd expect to find in an 18th century blacksmith shop. But the surrounding rock was the problem. Because that rock, the concretion that had formed around the hammer, dated, conservatively, to over 100 million years old. That's the Cretaceous period, the age of dinosaurs. And yet, here was something far too human. When I held it in my gloved hands, I didn't feel awe first. I felt doubt. That instinct every explorer has when the evidence defies reason. Could the rock have formed more recently, by some rare process? Could the hammer have fallen into a crevice, tricking the timeline? But the laboratory reports were firm. The concretion showed no signs of artificial manipulation. No break, no placement. It had formed slowly, naturally, layer by layer around the hammer itself. The hammer's head was composed of 96% iron, 2% chlorine, and 1% sulfur, a composition unlike modern alloys, and curiously resistant to rust. Its handle was organic, turning to coal where encased, as if it had been buried not just by soil but by epochs. Critics rushed in with skepticism, and rightly so. Claims like this demand scrutiny. Some insisted the rock was just a concretion formed in modern times, that the object was simply an 1800s miner's tool, encased by chance. Others hinted at outright fraud. But fraud has a pattern. This had none. There were no financial motives, no press tour, no museum bidding war. Just a strange object, found by strangers, left to gather dust, until someone asked, what if? What if our understanding of human history of the deep, distant past is less linear than we think? I spent a night camped near the site where it was first discovered, watching the moon rise over the red hills. Coyotes howled in the distance, but the land itself felt older than their cries. It's a place where the bones of reptiles lie just beneath the topsoil, where the ground remembers things we've forgotten. I wondered then, if time is a circle, could something, or someone, have been here before us? What if there were cycles? Civilizations that rose, fell, and vanished long before we ever set stone upon stone. The London hammer may not answer that, but it asks it, loudly. And sometimes, it's the question that matters more than the certainty. The hammer now sits quietly in a private collection, not in a vault, not under glass, just resting, a relic without a home in the timeline. We leave it behind for now, but not forgotten. Because every anomaly we find is another map pin, another breadcrumb in the dark forest of deep history. And whether it belongs to an ancient toolmaker or something far stranger, the message is clear. We were not the first to shape this world. We may not even be the first to forget it. The high desert of Idaho holds secrets in layers, not just in the basalt plains that stretch endlessly under the sky, but deep below, where time is measured in strata, not seasons. I stood at the edge of an old well site near Nampa, a place where the earth had been cut open, drilled, and left to settle again. It was in that drilling, back in 1889, that something surfaced no one expected. The report was almost shrugged off at first, a small object, lifted from nearly 300 feet underground, brought up in a gush of clay and pressurized water, not a rock, not a fossil, but something shaped. Something human. About the size of a chess piece, the figure was unmistakable. A doll, perhaps, crafted from fired clay. Its features were clear: head, arms, legs. A distinctly humanoid form with visible eyes and a marked headdress, a relic of human hands. But here's the part that freezes the breath in your throat. The layer it was pulled from beneath thick lava flows had been dated to the Pliocene epoch, over 2 million years old. I remember holding the replica of the figurine in my hands, the original now locked away in archives. Its surface wasn't eroded, as you'd expect from a geological trick. It was delicate, with intentional marks, the kind that come from a practiced artisan, not nature. The geological context was consistent. The drilling crew had bored through 15 feet of basalt lava, countless layers of clay, and down into compacted gravel. There was no opportunity for modern contamination. This wasn't something someone dropped into the ground last century. It had been sealed away for millennia. And the question grew louder with every silence that followed it. Who made this? Mainstream archaeology dismissed it quickly. A hoax, a misinterpretation. Perhaps a native artifact had somehow found its way into a deep crevice, long after the lava flows. But none of those theories held under scrutiny. The geological seals were unbroken. The clay had hardened inside an untouched matrix. If it was fake, it was the most brilliantly orchestrated one in American prehistory, planted at a time before even paleontology was formalized. That night in my tent, I sat by lantern light, with excavation notes spread across the floor. My hands still held the red stain of the day's dig, but my mind was adrift, not in Idaho, but in the distant past. I imagined a figure human, or something like it, sitting by a fire millions of years ago, sculpting a figurine from river clay, giving it a shape, a meaning, a soul. Then I imagined time folding over it, lava creeping in, ice, wind, the silence of buried centuries. And then, a drill. Could it be that what we call history is only the most recent chapter? What if there were pages before it written in symbols, forgotten languages, and artifacts we've learned to ignore? The Nampa figurine is barely an inch tall, but it casts a shadow longer than we can measure. In it is a challenge not just to archaeology, but to our assumptions. It whispers that we've barely begun to uncover the full story of human or pre-human presence on this planet. It may never appear in a museum. It may never be accepted by the textbooks. But in the strata beneath Nampa, Idaho, something was once alive, conscious, crafting, creating. And that is a truth no lava flow can bury forever. The air thinned as we ascended the Bayan Kara Ula Mountains, where the ridgelines twist like fossilized waves and silence settles over the stone like a shroud. The locals wouldn't guide us past a certain altitude. Bad spirits live there, one of them told me, eyes lowered. Not ours, not from here. It was in those forbidding heights on the border of Tibet and China that a lost expedition uncovered something buried not in tombs, but in stone itself. Not gold, not bone, but discs, hundreds of them. Flat, round, etched with spirals. Each one roughly a foot across, carved with strange symbols that spiraled from the center outward like a vinyl record pressed from memory instead of music. They were buried in rows inside ancient caves, alongside skeletons, small, frail, with massive craniums and unusually delicate limbs. The press called them the Dropa Stones. I remember crouching by one in particular, brushing away the powdery dust, revealing its glyphs in the flicker of my headlamp. The carvings weren't random. They followed a pattern not of language as we know it, but something older, something encoded. And there was no known script to match it. In the 1,960 seconds, Chinese archaeologist Tsum Nui risked his reputation by attempting to translate them. What he claimed to find was staggering: a message, a narrative, a story told across a dozen discs, the tale of a race of beings, the Dropa, who crash-landed in these mountains some 12,000 years ago, stranded, hunted, feared. According to the symbols, they came not from another land, but another star. It reads like myth, Like science fiction. So much so that the academic community rejected it outright. No publication would print it. His papers were buried or worse, vanished. Tsum Nui himself was later silenced by official means, his work lost to bureaucracy or design. But the stones remained. Each weighs just a few pounds. Their grooves are shallow, but precise, like a language that requires turning, listening, aligning thought and sound. I once brought a recording device to one and played a tone along its spiral. The frequency jumped. Some speculate they were storage devices, encoded with data information written in sound, not ink. Others think they are ceremonial, meant to guide the spirits of the dead across dimensions. But what lingers most isn't the discs. It's the bones. Those skeletal remains, locked away in university basements, were never formally classified. Too fragile for Homo sapiens, too ancient for Homo erectus. Something in between or beyond. I asked to see them once. I was told they'd been misplaced. The villages nearby still pass down oral stories of people who came from the clouds in vessels of light, of beings who taught them how to grow crops in the shadow of glaciers, who buried their dead with discs, not prayers. Most won't speak of it openly. Some won't speak of it at all. But standing in those caves, where the air tasted of dust and old secrets, I felt it, that hum beneath silence, that presence that doesn't need to be seen to be known. If the Dropa Stones are real, and I believe they are, they're not relics. They're warnings, or perhaps invitations, to remember that the sky was never empty, that we are not the only intelligence to touch this earth, and not the first to leave a message behind. The discs lie still, but their story spins on. It was the hush that struck me first, the kind of quiet you only find in sacred places. In the heart of Turin, behind vaulted stone and under relentless surveillance, I stood before the linen, not displayed, not paraded, simply kept, as if reverence demanded silence. The Shroud of Turin. To some, it is the burial cloth of Christ. To others, an elaborate forgery from the Middle Ages. But when I saw it with my own eyes, just briefly, under soft light, it didn't feel like a hoax. It felt intentional, timeless. The fabric is simple. Woven linen, yellowed with age, just over 14 feet long, 3 feet wide. But what arrests the breath is what hovers faintly on its surface. The front and back image of a man. Not drawn, not painted, but stained, or perhaps something else entirely. The face is calm, bearded, eyes closed, as if caught in the moment between life and legend. No pigment, no brushstroke, no pressure pattern can explain how the image was formed. The fibers themselves hold only trace discoloration, no ink, no dye. Under ultraviolet light, it reveals even more. Negative imaging, like a photographic plate developed centuries before photography. I've studied it under magnification, held replicas under forensic lights. The figure bears wounds, wrists pierced, side gashed, scalp marked by punctures, consistent with crucifixion, but different from how medieval artists imagined it. Most depicted nails through the palms. Here, they pass through the wrists medically accurate, and not common knowledge in the 14th century when the shroud first surfaced in European records. The carbon dating performed in the 1980 seconds labeled it as medieval, around 1260 to 1390. But those samples came from the edge of the cloth, where it had been repaired after a fire. Later analysis suggested those fibers were contaminated newer, not original. And the mystery deepened. No one can replicate the image today. No scientist, no artist. Attempts using heat, acid, radiation, or light fail to recreate its spectral precision. Some theories suggest a burst of energy, ultraviolet radiation, focused and instantaneous, as if the cloth absorbed the aftermath of something beyond human comprehension. But even if it were just a forgery, it remains an impossibility. There are fingerprints encoded in the fabric, bloodstains that test as real type AB, human, and pollen trapped in the weave, native to plants found only in the Levant during the spring. not medieval France. Not Italy, Jerusalem. I remember the old priest who guided me to the viewing room. He didn't try to convince me of anything. He simply said, "Whether you believe it or not, it has outlived the men who tried to erase it." That line stuck with me, because the Shroud is more than just a relic. It is an artifact of belief, burned into cloth, echoing through science, myth, and devotion alike. It defies categories, it demands patience, and whether divine or deceptive, it speaks to something deeply human, the need to preserve what we cannot hold. When I stepped out into the sunlight again, the world felt sharper, as if some invisible line between what is real and what is remembered had shifted. I left without answers, but not without wonder. Some truths aren't made of evidence. They're made of endurance, and whatever the Shroud truly is, it has endured. The Mojave Desert can play tricks on the mind. Heat shimmers off the gravel, shadows shift with the wind. But what we found that day, outside Olancha, California, it wasn't a mirage. It was embedded in stone, and it shouldn't have been there. We were hunting for geodes, those hollow stones that crack open to reveal glittering crystals inside. But this one cracked differently, not into crystals, into questions. It was January 1936, when a group of rockhounds brought the stone back to their shop. One strike with a diamond saw, and the silence of geological time shattered. Inside the solid nodule, nearly a foot in diameter, was something no one expected. Metal. It sat at the center, like a heart inside a fossil. A cylindrical object, tightly encased, corroded, but clearly manufactured, threaded at one end, encased in what looked like porcelain. It wasn't natural. It wasn't ancient ore. It was mechanical. The Coso artifact, they called it. To the untrained eye, it resembled a spark plug, not from a mythic age from a Ford Model T, but the concretion that surrounded it told a different story. Experts estimated it had taken at least 500,000 years to form naturally. Some claimed the nodule was even older, potentially over 1,000,000 years, judging by the fossilized shells trapped within its matrix. And yet here was this thing, machined, centered, perfectly balanced. I held a replica in my hand during my visit to the Mineralogical Society that once examined it. It was surprisingly light, delicate even, not the crude work of an ancient civilization, but precision grade, purposeful, familiar, in a deeply unfamiliar context. Skeptics argue it's a hoax, that the object somehow fell into a natural cavity and the stone formed quickly around it, a rare, accelerated process. Others say the rock was never fully analyzed by independent geologists, that dating was speculative. And yet, the original artifact? It vanished. Not stolen, not displayed, just gone, misplaced in the shuffle of disinterest. Its photographic record is all we have, left a few X-rays and images taken under harsh lighting, showing what appears to be a metallic core surrounded by ceramic insulation and a hexagonal casing. The resemblance to a 1922 era champion spark plug is hard to deny, but that only deepens the mystery. How does a modern spark plug find itself sealed in a 500,000-year-old geological formation? Dropped by time travelers? A lost relic from a pre-human civilization? Or something else entirely, an artifact not from our history, but from another's? I remember that night, camping just a few miles from where the Coso stone was first discovered. The sky overhead burned with stars, cold and indifferent. I held a piece of desert stone in my hand, rough, ancient, unchanged for eons, and I wondered, what else lies hidden beneath these sands, sealed in layers we'll never think to break? The earth does not reveal its secrets easily. It buries them in silence, in weight, in time. And every so often, it cracks and something impossible peers through. The Coso artifact is not just a spark plug. It is a spark, a flicker of something long lost or long ahead. And it leaves behind a single, haunting question. If this doesn't belong to our world, whose world did it come from? The banks of the Mureș River in Romania don't look like a place for miracles. The soil is thick with iron. The trees lean toward the river like they've heard stories they can't forget. And in the late 1972, when construction crews began digging into that ground near Aiud, they thought they had simply uncovered bones. What they unearthed, however, would ignite decades of debate. The bones belonged to a mastodon extinct for at least 10,000 years. But nearby, buried in the same sediment, was something that didn't belong to any age we understand. A chunk of metal, wedge-shaped, about 8 inches long, dull gray. At first, they thought it might be part of a plow, or maybe a tool from the modern era accidentally dropped and buried. But there was a problem, or rather, several. The wedge was covered in a thick oxide patina, suggesting immense age. Tests revealed that it was composed of 90% aluminum, with traces of copper, zinc, lead, and other elements, a blend not common even in modern industrial tools. But here's the part that turns mystery into anomaly. Aluminum wasn't isolated and processed on Earth until the 19th century. It's not found in pure form in nature. Extracting it requires advanced metallurgy, electricity, heat, and controlled chemical reactions. In other words, the wedge shouldn't exist. Some called it a hoax. Others, especially Romanian researchers who initially examined it, thought it might have been part of an aircraft. Not one of ours, but from before ours. I held a cast of it in my hands in a dusty university archive. The surface was pitted, almost biological in its irregularity, like it had been underwater for centuries. Yet the form was engineered. Clean edges, not sculpted, but manufactured. And that's when the comparisons began. Engineers noticed the wedge's shape bore a strong resemblance to the landing feet used on space probes. The angle, the taper, the weight distribution, as if it had once been part of a device designed not for Earth, but to land on Earth. Could it have been from a lost civilization with knowledge of metallurgy far beyond what we credit them? Or was it something even stranger, something not of this Earth at all? The Romanian government was quick to silence the story. The object was locked away. Tests were redacted. Scientists who spoke openly were ridiculed or reassigned. And the wedge slipped from public view into the murk of suppressed memory. Yet rumors persist. Some say the site where it was found was once sacred to the Dacians, a people who claimed their ancestors came from the stars. Others say similar alloys have been found in unmarked crash sites across Eastern Europe, always buried, always ignored. I stood near the river where it was first uncovered. The waters were slow that day, almost thoughtful, carrying leaves down paths etched by centuries. And I wondered, was this wedge part of a machine that touched down long before we were watching the skies? We often assume the future lies ahead, but what if the evidence of it lies buried behind us? The Aiud wedge may never be explained, but in its silent, metallic form, it delivers a challenge to admit we don't know everything, that our timeline might be wrong, or worse, incomplete. And somewhere in that missing space, between known and forgotten, someone once dropped a piece of technology into the mud, and the Earth for a moment remembered. The Peruvian desert is not a quiet place. It breathes dust and heat, whispering stories through sandstone and bone. I had come for petroglyphs, ancient ones, but what I found inside a cave near Ica felt like something else entirely. Something that didn't belong. Hundreds of black stones, some smooth, others jagged, all carved and all wrong. They call them the Ica stones. Each one etched with impossibility. Men riding dinosaurs. Open-heart surgeries performed with scalpels and masks. Astronomical charts plotted with unknown constellations. And not crude drawings. These were detailed, precise, intentional. They weren't just images. They were statements. The stones first surfaced in the 1,960 seconds when a local farmer claimed he had found them buried in a dry riverbed. Dozens became hundreds, then thousands, stored in private rooms, museum basements, and the home of Dr. Javier Kebra, the man who devoted his life to decoding them. I remember entering Kebra's personal archive, where walls of stones rose like bookshelves, each one whispering something different, but all united in the same quiet defiance of accepted history. Dinosaurs with human hands guiding them by reins, surgeons performing organ transplants under what looked like arc lamps, a brain surgery veins carefully mapped held in the hands of people who shouldn't have even known what a brain was. And then the stars. Maps of planets in positions we only confirmed with modern telescopes. Depictions of solar alignments only visible from above the atmosphere, etched with an understanding that seemed impossible. Of course, the outcry was immediate. Hoax, said the archaeologists. Forgeries, made to sell to tourists. They pointed to a local man who admitted to carving some of the stones for profit. Case closed. But not all the stones. Some had carvings eroded by time. Some were pulled from beneath unbroken strata of sediment. Others matched no tools available locally. And if it were simply a tourist scam, why depict scenes so precise, so strange, that they would drive people away in confusion? Kebra believed the stones told the story of a lost civilization not just pre-Incan, but pre-human in the conventional sense. A people who lived in cycles, whose knowledge came not from slow evolution, but from inheritance or intervention. Even the local legend supported it. The Quechua people spoke of sky beings who taught them healing, of thunder lizards that once walked beside them, of star maps passed down not through story, but symbol. I ran my fingers over one of the stones under desert light. It was cold, heavier than it looked. The carving was worn, but deliberate, a humanoid figure, hand outstretched to a lizard with crests down its back. Their eyes met, not as predator and prey, but as equals. It's easy to dismiss, to laugh, to say, these are fantasy. But what kind of fantasy survives in stone, in secret, with no audience for praise? The stones challenge not just science, but our imagination. They force us to ask, what if memory is longer than history? What if something intelligent walked this earth before us and left behind a record we weren't meant to understand? The Ica stones are not proof, but they are provocation. And as the desert winds howl through the valleys of Peru, I wonder if they are still whispering, not to convince, but to remind, that what we call the impossible is often just the truth we haven't accepted yet. The air in the Ethiopian highlands is thin and sharp, like the edge of something ancient that never dulled. I had come for manuscripts, for the quiet wisdom of monks and dust-covered chronicles. But in the ruins of a church long since claimed by ivy and silence, we found something that should not have survived. A clay cylinder, sealed, unmarked, hidden beneath a collapsed altar, as if tucked away not for preservation, but protection. We cracked it open with care, expecting scroll fragments or maybe relic beads. What we found was far more dangerous. Inside was a rolled parchment, brittle, darkened with soot, but still intact, and on it, a script unlike any I'd ever seen. It wasn't pure Ge'ez, though traces of the ancient Semitic tongue lingered in its strokes, nor was it purely Coptic. There were symbols, geometric, almost mathematical, interwoven like threads through a tapestry of forgotten language. It would come to be called the Kebra Nagast cylinder, not because it was related directly to the biblical manuscript of the same name, but because its script referenced similar events from a vastly different perspective. The opening line chilled me. We are not born of this world, but sent from the libraries of the sky. Who wrote that? Scholars who examined the parchment dated the material itself to around the 6th century AD, yet the language resisted classification. It referenced a kingdom older than Aksum, older than Kush. A kingdom that stored knowledge in vaults not of stone or clay, but of sound and Sunday. The document described a library destroyed in flame, not fire, but something that came from the sky. A second sun, it said, that split the earth and scattered the keepers. I remember sitting under a fig tree just outside the ruins, reading that passage over and over. It didn't feel allegorical. It felt like a confession. A warning from something or someone that had watched history burn more than once. There were names in the text not of people but objects. Zafara, the vessel of memory. Camelot, the voice that taught stars their orbits. Teneharai, the Shadow King who spoke in thunder. They weren't characters. They were entities. Perhaps machines. Perhaps minds. The cylinder didn't tell their whole story. Just fragments. As if the full truth had been hidden across many scrolls, many languages, waiting to be found in pieces. The monks we spoke to nearby refused to touch the artifact. One of them, a weathered elder with eyes like obsidian, told me, "That scroll remembers too much. It remembers the time before God taught us to forget." And that's what stayed with me. Because there are ruins across Ethiopia that don't fit the narrative megaliths shaped with impossible precision, monoliths aligned to stellar positions long outdated. Some of the oldest churches were built on top of much older foundations, foundations they say were not made by man, but for him. The Kebra Nagast cylinder now sits sealed in a private archive, unavailable to the public. Its content officially dismissed as proto-scriptural mysticism, another way of saying we don't know. But I know what I read. It was a message in a bottle, cast not across oceans but time, a fragment of a library swallowed by the ages. Not a myth, not a miracle, a memory. And in that memory, a whisper. When the stars return to their place, so will the words. It was in a muddy field in northern France where I first encountered one, a small bronze object, half buried in the soil, glinting in the morning sun like a forgotten star. 12 faces, each pierced with a perfectly circular hole, protruding knobs at every corner. The shape was geometric, but the feeling it gave was anything but mathematical. It looked like something that had fallen from a machine, or a mind far ahead of its time. This was a Roman dodecahedron. Over 100 have been found across Europe, from the British Isles to the heart of ancient Germania. No two are identical. Some are the size of golf balls, others like grapefruits. All share the same eerie design. 12 pentagonal faces, each one bearing a hole. None drilled quite the same size. Solid bronze, no inscriptions, no maker's mark. And not a single surviving Roman text mentions them. No diagrams, no commentary, no explanation. We found them in graves, in fields, in hoards, but never with a context that gives them away. Tools, toys, religious icons, every theory feels too simple, too convenient. I visited a museum in Germany that had 6 of them on display, locked behind glass. Even there, under artificial light and modern labels, they refused to explain themselves. One curator told me they are the only Roman artifacts we've found that don't make sense, and that's why we lock them away. One theory suggests they were measuring devices, tools used by engineers or architects to calculate angles or determine the correct sowing date based on sun position. But when reconstructed, the holes don't align consistently. The math doesn't add up. Another theory says they were candle holders, but the metals used show no signs of soot or heat. A child's toy, perhaps? But they appear too complex, too costly to produce en masse, especially in an empire known for pragmatism. Some archaeologists have suggested they were part of a ritual held during certain festivals, used in divination, or placed atop staffs as symbols of unknown gods. But the Romans were fastidious record keepers. Even their wine recipes survived. Yet these? Nothing. And then, the more fringe ideas. That they were part of some ancient machine. That the differing hole sizes corresponded to frequencies that when spun, they channeled sound or vibration. I met a physicist once who claimed the layout mimicked stellar patterns, that each dodecahedron was like a compass pointing not north, but upward. I remember holding one replica during a night alone in the ruins of a Roman bathhouse. The object fit perfectly in my palm. Cold at first, then warm, balanced in a way that felt purposeful. What troubled me wasn't just that we didn't know what it was. It was the suspicion that maybe we were never meant to. Maybe it belonged to a different layer of Roman society. Not the emperors or soldiers, but the thinkers, the mystics, those who walked between science and sorcery. Those who understood that not all knowledge is meant for marble plaques and temples. And maybe that's why they left no explanation, because some things are meant to be used, not described. The Roman dodecahedrons remain one of the most compelling enigmas of the ancient world, not because they are strange, but because they are so close to familiar. They feel like something we should understand. But don't. They are a whisper in bronze, a message written in shape, not script. And every time I see one, I feel that quiet pulse again, the sense that someone, long ago, was playing with truths we've yet to rediscover. The mines near Ottosdal, South Africa, are deep not just in the earth, but in time. The rocks pulled from their shafts are ancient, Precambrian, formed long before vertebrates wriggled through primeval seas. And it was within these rocks, some 3 billion years old, that the miners began finding them. Spheres. Perfect, mysterious, infuriating. The locals call them grooved stones. Others call them the Klerksdorp spheres, named after the town where they were first catalogued. About the size of a golf ball, they are smooth and symmetrical, with delicate ridges running perfectly around their circumference. Some are made of hematite, others of a nickel-rich alloy, both incredibly hard. Hard enough that, in some cases, the miners' tools couldn't scratch them. And inside the stone, surrounding them, sedimentary layers compacted long before any human or tool was ever born. I remember holding one in a mining office, its surface cold and flawless. My fingers traced the grooves, which were so uniform they felt machine-made. But how could that be? 3 billion years ago, Earth was barely cooled from chaos. No plants, no animals, just microbial life, breathing out the first whispers of oxygen. And yet here was a sphere, balanced, grooved, as if turned on a lathe. Geologists offered explanations, of course. Concretions, they said. Naturally formed nodules created by mineral accumulation around a core. Nature, after all, loves a sphere. It's the most efficient shape in the universe. But these weren't crude or random. The grooves were deep and consistent. Some spheres had axial balance, they spun evenly. Others had metallic compositions not normally found in sedimentary rock. And yet, somehow, they were there. The miners, rough men hardened by heat and time, were the first to sense the anomaly. They told stories of tools that bounced off the spheres, of stones that seemed to hum under pressure. One even claimed a sphere rolled uphill on its own. Was it superstition, or was something else at work? I took one to a lab in Cape Town, where we scanned it under high-resolution 3D mapping. No tool marks, no signs of sculpting, just perfect grooves, spaced with eerie precision. It was as if the Earth itself had created something it shouldn't know how to make. There are those who believe the spheres are remnants not of our world, but of visitors, that they are probes, monitors, devices built not by chance but design, left here in the early chapters of Earth's story, perhaps to watch, or to wait. I once spoke with a Zulu elder who'd heard of the stones. He told me, those are the eggs of the first people. The ones who came before the stars knew their names. I didn't laugh, because sometimes myth remembers what history forgets. Could they be remnants of a forgotten technology? Could intelligent life, whether human or other, have arisen before the fossil record even began? Or are they simply the result of a planet capable of shaping its own riddles? Either way, the Klerksdorp spheres remain unanswered. No one can replicate their formation exactly. No one can prove how they came to be inside rocks older than complex life. They sit now in quiet museum drawers and private safes, labeled as curiosities, as geological mysteries. But when I held one in the quiet of my tent that night, it didn't feel like a rock. It felt like a message, from who or what I may never know. But in that perfect shape, older than bones, older than dreams, I heard it. You are not the first to wonder. In the canyons of southwest Texas, Where the Rio Grande slices through jagged limestone like a forgotten scar, I stood beneath a wall older than memory. The air was still. Even the wind seemed hesitant to disturb what lingered there. Stretched across 24 feet of rock was a vision, not a mural, not quite a painting, more like a transmission. Etched in ochre, white, and blood-red pigments, the figures danced before me in silence. The White Shaman panel. They told me it was over 4,000 years old, created by a forgotten people we call the Pecos River culture. But this wasn't art as we know it. This was language, geometry, ceremony, and possibly a map. The central figure stood tall, his arms outstretched, head crowned in jagged rays like lightning or flame. Around him, serpents coiled, lines flowed from chest to sky. Smaller beings followed behind him in a vertical ascent, as if climbing not a ladder but a beam of light. The archaeologists offered interpretations: ritual, myth, psychedelic trance. They said the figure was a shaman, channeling the gods of the hunt, caught mid-vision on a mescaline journey. A dream, painted in stone. But I wasn't so sure. I studied the smaller glyphs flanking the panel: concentric circles, lattice patterns, strange intersecting arcs. They weren't decorative. They were technical. Diagrams, maybe. Coordinates. And the serpents. They weren't just symbols of life or death. They looked like energy. I'd seen something like this before, not in temples, but in star maps. The Hopi, the Dogon, the Aborigines of Australia. Cultures separated by oceans and centuries, all depicting the same thing. Beings descending from the sky through spiraling portals of light. Was the White Shaman a person, or a representation of something far older? Some believe the panel isn't just a depiction, it's a doorway, a Stargate, a place where worlds overlap, where language breaks, and something else speaks in shape, in light, in echo. I remember the guide who led me there, a man from the nearby Kickapoo tribe. He didn't speak as we approached. Only after I had stood in silence for nearly an hour did he murmur, "That wall has heard voices not meant for us." He wouldn't elaborate. We camped nearby that night. The canyon walls loomed like stone guardians. Coyotes howled in patterns too even. I stared into the flames, then back toward the panel, now hidden in darkness. Was it memory I felt? Or anticipation? Later studies of the pigment revealed something strange. The white coloring the namesake of the panel contained trace elements not native to the region. Rare clays, possibly imported, possibly traded, or maybe brought by someone not from this world. And still, no tools were found, no scaffolding, no brushes, just the panel and silence. I asked an archaeologist if we'd ever know what it really meant. He just smiled sadly and said, "Sometimes we find the message, but lose the language." I left the canyon with more questions than answers, as it should be. Because the White Shaman panel isn't just an artifact. It's a threshold between what we are and what we've forgotten. Between the sky we see and the sky that watches back. It was deep in the Russian wilderness, not far from the banks of the Tunguska River, that I saw it. A gray stone cracked open like a geode, but what it revealed inside wasn't crystal. It was structure. A spiral, metallic, coiled with purpose. It looked like a screw. They called it the Kaluga anomaly at first. Discovered in the 1,990 seconds during an expedition searching for meteorite fragments, it was a fluke, a glint of something unnatural in the fossil-rich sandstone. Scientists brought it back, assuming it was a piece of equipment lost during a previous dig, until they examined the surrounding matrix. The rock it was embedded in dated to over 300 million years ago, the Carboniferous period. Long before birds, before mammals, before even the age of dinosaurs, the era of towering ferns and giant insects. But inside this ancient stone was something unmistakably modern. The screw measured just over an inch in length, threaded with a hexagonal head and spiral grooves. Analysis revealed it was composed of a metal alloy containing tungsten, an element not commonly found in nature in usable form, and one that requires extremely high temperatures to manipulate. In short, it shouldn't be there. I remember seeing the X-ray of the rock, which revealed two things. First, that the object was fully encased within the stone. No breaks, no fractures, no chance it had simply fallen into a crack. Second, the threading was regular, uniform, machine-made. The Russian Academy of Sciences launched an investigation. Officially, they called it a pseudo-fossil, a natural concretion that resembled a screw. Others said it was simply contamination, modern debris that had somehow found its way into the site. But those who examined the artifact firsthand weren't so sure. One geologist I met in Moscow whispered his theory over tea in a quiet cafe. There was intelligence here, long before us, long before language. We just keep digging through their garbage. And it does feel like garbage, or perhaps a relic. A piece of something larger. Not decorative, not symbolic. A component, a part. Of what? Some believe it's evidence of an ancient civilization, one lost not by war or famine, but by time itself. Others go further, suggesting it's not from Earth at all. That the screw was a remnant of a probe, an observer, something that came and left. Or perhaps something that never left at all. Standing on the tundra, surrounded by silence and stone, I imagined what this world looked like 300 million years ago. Swamps, insects with wingspans longer than my arm, no cities, no fire. No thought as we understand it. And yet, in the rock beneath my boots, a spiral, as if something had pressed itself into the earth to be found. Was it a message? An accident? Or a mistake in the timeline, a thread left in the weave of Earth's forgotten past? The screw now rests in a locked vault, the original's location kept deliberately vague. Its story is told in whispers, in scanned documents, in grainy black and white photos passed among those who still believe that the Earth hasn't told us everything yet. And every so often, I take out the printed scan of that X-ray, hold it to the light, and see the spiral so familiar, so wrong. And I wonder, what else is wound tightly beneath the skin of this planet, waiting for us to turn the right stone? The desert of Upper Egypt doesn't give up its dead easily. The sand clings to time like a secret lover burying, grinding, erasing. But in the limestone quarries near Nazlet, Khater, the earth cracked open and offered a mystery. It wasn't gold. It wasn't scrolls. It was a skeleton. Alone, intact, and out of place. At first glance, it seemed like any Upper Paleolithic burial. A young adult male, surrounded by flint tools, buried in a shallow grave beneath the quarry floor. But the details broke the script. This man, now known only as Nazlet Khater II, wasn't just another hunter-gatherer. He was something else. Something the textbooks weren't expecting. His skeleton was tall, robust, and anatomically modern, but his skull was different. The cranium was elongated, the facial structure broader. The mandibular shape closer to archaic Homo species, like Homo erectus. A hybrid, some whispered. A throwback. Or perhaps something else entirely. He lived roughly 35,000 years ago, a time when Homo sapiens were still exploring the edges of their new world. But the tools buried with him were more advanced than expected for the region. Polished stone axes, carved blades, objects showing craftsmanship that should have taken millennia more to develop. I remember holding a replica of one of those blades. It felt too refined, too intentional for the time it supposedly came from, as if the hands that shaped it carried memory from elsewhere, from someone or something older. And then there was the DNA, or rather, the lack of it. Attempts to extract viable genetic material failed, not degraded, not contaminated, just absent. As if the desert, or fate, had conspired to keep this man's ancestry hidden. The team that discovered him in the 1,980 seconds sent reports across the globe. The reaction from the academic community was swift and cautious. Most papers referred to him as morphologically unusual, a footnote in the saga of human evolution. But some researchers saw more. Theories surfaced that Nazlet Khater too might be evidence of an interbreeding event not between modern humans and Neanderthals, but something older, something not yet named. Others suggested he might represent a branch of humanity that evolved in parallel, advanced but erased. One Egyptian anthropologist told me, "We always assume that we are the end of the story. But what if we're just the ones who survived?" That night, I walked the quarry alone. The sand hissed with wind. I thought about how many others might be buried beneath my feet, erased by erosion, ground into anonymity, and how this one man, this anomaly, slipped through the cracks in time. The tools, the bone structure, the silence of his genome, it all felt like a puzzle not yet translated. In local lore, there are stories of giants, of desert spirits who walked like men but spoke in thunder. Could these be memories warped by centuries of another kind of human? Or of something that simply wore the shape of one? Nazlet Khater, too, has no name, no known descendants, no cultural marker. But he holds a place in our story, not as an ancestor perhaps, but as a reminder that the family tree of humanity has more branches than we've dared to admit. And maybe more roots. He lies now in a quiet museum drawer, catalogued, measured, disbelieved. But he is still there. The stranger in the quarry, the one who doesn't fit, and perhaps never was meant to. The wind rolled low over the plains of Şanlıurfa, Turkey dry, ancient air that felt as if it had passed over 1,000 forgotten graves. I stood at the edge of a low hill, nondescript to the untrained eye. But beneath this mound was something that should not exist. A temple. Older than the wheel, older than writing, older than cities. Göbekli Tepe. When it was first uncovered in the 1990 seconds, most assumed it was a medieval ruin, a crusader outpost perhaps. But carbon dating shattered that illusion. The stone pillars, carved with animals long extinct, were over 11,000 years old. That's 6,000 years before Stonehenge. 7,000 years before the pyramids. This wasn't just older than history. It was older than what we believed was possible. I remember the first time I stepped down into the excavation pit. The pillars towered above me, T-shaped monoliths arranged in circular enclosures. They weren't randomly placed. Each stone faced specific points. Aligned, designed. Some bore images. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, vultures, creatures of the wild, of transformation, of sky and soil. But there were no signs of domestic life. No hearths, no homes, no farms. It wasn't a village. It was a temple. And that's where the mystery deepens. According to everything we thought we knew, temples come after agriculture, after settlement. Religion, we believed, emerged to reinforce social structure, not the other way around. But Göbekli Tepe flips that story. This temple wasn't built by farmers. It was built by hunter-gatherers, nomads, people we once thought too primitive to organize labor or shape stone, and yet here were multi-ton megaliths, arranged with mathematical precision. Here was a sacred space meant to last through millennia. And then they buried it. Yes, buried. Intentionally. Layer upon layer of rubble and sediment poured in by hand, as if they wanted it hidden, preserved, or maybe silenced. Why? No one knows. Some believe it was a sanctuary, a place where sky rituals were performed not just for the stars, but with them. The central pillars in some enclosures appear to represent figures' arms carved at their sides, hands clasped around belts, not idols. Beings. Some point to carvings that resemble constellations Scorpio, Orion. Some suggest an astronomical event encoded in the temple's layout, perhaps even a comet impact. echoing the Younger Dryas extinction. Others whisper of more unorthodox origins. That Göbekli Tepe was a message, a calendar, a gateway, built not for humans, but with help. I sat beneath one of the outer pillars at dusk, the call to prayer echoing in the valley below. The sun bled across the stone. The carvings glowed gold in shadow. And I felt it. Not the presence of gods, but the weight of memory. This wasn't the beginning of civilization. It was the reminder that we are not the first to seek meaning in stone and sky. Göbekli Tepe stands as a monument to a forgotten intelligence, not just in skill, but in spirit. Whoever built it had vision, not just of the heavens, but of eternity. The site is still being excavated. Less than 10% of the hill has been uncovered, and every new stone pulls us deeper into a past we no longer recognize. History said civilization began with farming, but perhaps it began with wonder, and Göbekli Tepe silent, buried, waiting is the proof. The last light fades as I pack away the notes, each one still warm from the touch of memory. 15 fragments, 15 places where history bent beneath my hands, and still, the map feels unfinished. These weren't just discoveries. They were refusals. Refusals to fit, refusals to explain themselves cleanly. They stand where the known world ends, strange artifacts, silent witnesses, too old, too perfect, too present. Some buried under lava, others pulled from ice, sea, and stone. All whispering the same quiet truth. We do not know everything. In every excavation, I've felt it, that breath of the impossible brushing the back of my neck. That sense that someone long ago reached through the veil of time to leave a single trace. A coin in the forest, a screw in the sandstone, a temple beneath the soil. Proof not of what we know, but what we've forgotten. Science will test them, debate them, archive them, but these anomalies do not bow to consensus. They are reminders that history is not a line. It is a labyrinth, and for those willing to follow it, the walls speak. I've learned one thing on this path. History doesn't whisper. It waits. Waits for the hand to brush away the dirt. Waits for the eye to notice what doesn't belong. Waits for us to listen not just to the facts, but to the silence between the pages. This chapter ends here, but the journey continues. Because out there, beneath jungle canopy, desert floor, and forgotten vaults, the past is still alive, still watching. And somewhere, another secret is waiting to be found.